stuff we were talking.
We're rolling.
Well, you were asking what other things went on in those early days, and of course, one of the things that I was involved in was getting Paducah and Portsmouth on the map. They were gas diffusion plants, and Paducah duplicated stages that we had in K-25 as well. Portsmouth had additional stages that were a different type, and I don't want to describe it much, but it also involved inventions that I made. The basic type of gaseous diffusion that they used, if you were to look at the individual at the plant on the inside, you would see that it looks different from the stages that in the plant on the inside of either K-25 and Portsmouth, Oak Ridge and Portsmouth, and those differences are due to the inventions that I made. Keep in mind, I'm very careful in not saying the word patents, because we didn't award patents in those days. We should have probably, secret patents. But I got plenty of letters from Clark Center with dollar bills in it, and the one for Portsmouth was included. So that was also part of the work that was going on. And I think I mentioned that we also helped Y-12 and worked with Oak Ridge National Laboratory in producing in separation, forming separation processes, designing.
And was there any conflict that occurred with the management?
Well, I had a batting average. Not all of my ideas were accepted. And I usually thought I was right, even the ones that weren't accepted. So you want to call that a disagreement with management. Bill Humes was one of my favorite people. But I made a suggestion concerning the Y-12 process that he didn't accept as fast as I thought he should have, and as a consequence, I feel we wasted some money on a outdated proposition. Had they accepted my suggestion, we would have saved that money. However, in fairness, it's easier to conclude that looking back with 20/20 hindsight, and it wasn't all that sure that I was right. I turned out to be right. And so I can be smug and make this statement, but it would have been much harder to make at the time.
Right.
I thought I was right, but I couldn't prove it. And I could have turned out to be wrong.
Your inventions that you're talking about, can you talk about some of those things, or is that information classified?
Well, I've already told you a little bit about it. Instead of having two compressors for each stage, as the K-25 Kellex, K-25, K-27 Kellex designs did. Mm-hmm. My designs had only one pump or compressor to each stage, and it had it made more efficiencies possible by my approach than if we had followed the previous approach. Now, beyond that, I don't think I can go. Okay. I've also mentioned that if you went inside the plant and looked at the piping, and you can do that they had demonstration cells for both, and there are articles with sketches that show you the essential K-25 type stage, and which was the Kellex stage, and the Union Carbide stage. And what I'm saying is, if you look either at the drawings or at those drawings that were published, or the demonstration cells, the outstanding differences that you would notice were due to to inventions. Almost said it. Due to inventions that I made, either alone or with a co-author or two. So I wasn't just wasting my time or twiddling with little things. These inventions had major impact, and they were used.
What sort of roles did women have at the facility?
No, hardly any managerial responsibilities. I remember when I came back from New York, I remember I had a gal working for me as a secretary that I thought, and I told her she was wasting her time. She should take a course or two, in either at work or at a university, and she hardly needed any courses. She was a professional secretary, and to go into management herself. I encouraged her to do that, and she eventually did, and became a very successful manager, and then left, and started a business in Oak Ridge of her own. But so some of the gals were very smart, and in comparison to the guys, I always thought she had many advantages.
Do you still speak with her?
Yeah. As I said, most of the people that reported to me are still my friends.
Do you think that she'd like to do an interview with us and sit down?
She might.
She might. Well, why don't...
I don't know how early she was at... I suspect she was here before 1949, but I don't know for sure.
Okay. Well, when we get done, afterwards, we'll sit down and
Okay.
we'll get that.
Her name is Nelline Ross.
Nelline Ross. I actually know.
I think she's in the phone book.
Okay. Wonderful.
She went into the business of producing swimming pools, or swimming pool equipment. I'm not sure she produced swimming pools, but she did produce swimming pool equipment, and had eventually 2 stores. I don't know whether she's still in the business or not, but she became a manager as a female, which at that time was somewhat unusual. Not as unusual as it would have been when I started. In the 40s, it would have been really noted. And yet, it was clear to me that she had many managerial qualities that were above average, and therefore would have been outperforming the average guy.
Did you notice that women were treated any different, besides the fact that they didn't have managerial positions?
Sure. But it's hard to separate. You didn't have, when it came time to bring the coffee into the meetings, you wouldn't find the guys doing it, you would find the secretaries doing it. Now, was that because they were women or because they were secretaries?
Right.
So, but that certainly was the case, that they had certain duties that they were taken for granted as being their duties. You could argue there wasn't so much sex discrimination as it was, that portion of it was just treating them as secretaries, and therefore less pay and less valuable, less money wasted by getting them to make coffee or get coffee from the cafeteria.
And what about minorities? Were you in contact with any African Americans or?
Yeah, similar. I think they just didn't compete for certain jobs, and probably rightly so, because they didn't think they'd have a chance. They would just be considered to be uppity, and so you didn't see black managers, especially top managers. in the early days. But you would see them afterwards, and again, I had a black secretary at one point, and they were capable of doing more than secretarial business. I'm just saying there was a time when I wouldn't have expected to see a black secretary, but then there were plenty of them, and eventually they worked up the ladder into positions that only white males had filled in the past. Then, of course, in addition to that, you had the sort of sudden little social explosions at Clinton in high school and in the schools. You know, when the local people were forced to mix in the public school, which happened while I was in New York, I believe. So I didn't have first-hand exposure to the struggles that went on, but I read about them. Those are some of the real differences that existed between the early days and the subsequent days. And of course, technology was refined, and many things that were done manually were later done automated. One of the good examples of this is the computer itself. We had at one stage, I should have mentioned that, at one stage we had about close to a dozen girls punching Marchant and Friedens and all kinds of calculators, machines, like a typewriter, except with numbers, in order to solve the technical equations that we had for design purposes. So we worked 10 or 12 gals like we today would work a computer, except the computer would do a much better job, okay, and faster. But eventually the Friedens and the Marchants were replaced by the forerunners of today's computers. And they were produced mostly by IBM. And I was a user, basically, of those computers in the very early days. So my exposure as a user to computer dates back to the 1950s.
What were they like back in the 1950s?
Very slow by today's standards, very fast by the standards of what the girls were trying to do in the Marchants and Friedens. You know, everything has its base of comparison. You could look down. You were on a ladder, on a technological ladder, and you could look down and you could look up.
Sure.
And we're still cutting back on the size of computers. In those early days, all the computers had to be air conditioned. They were so big and so powerful that one of the biggest expenses was putting them into rooms where they were air conditioned, so that they could operate. Today, a computer doesn't care whether you have air conditioning or not. different technologies. That's also the time that transistors were invented, not by me, but by other people, and vacuum tubes started to disappear because the transistor was doing exactly the same thing and more that the vacuum tubes were doing. And so instead of having a bunch of vacuum tubes with pretty short lives, and then you had to replace the individual vacuum tubes, the transistor's life was much longer. You rarely heard of a transistor having to be replaced. So that whole computing area shifted during my career. And it's still shifting.
Oh, absolutely. It's going to continue to just grow and grow.
Yeah, even the things you can do. This earlier I mentioned internet, you know, punching an unknown word, something that you wanted to know more about, into the computer and being flooded with information, and have them present that information in a logical sequence where the information that people asked the most of was taken to be granted to be more important than the other information which only you were asking for, but nobody else. So they would rank it, and they would have in the front end of maybe 1,000 references. First of all, you'd only see 10, and all 10 of those would be popular, would have earned the right to be in the first 10 by popular request. So you were going by the experiences of customers before you today. So if I want to find out something specific, like what kind of, if I'm worried about bioattacks, what are the most likely biological agents that a terrorist would use today? How are they ranked and listed? I can find that out, but nothing classified about it. I punched the button on the computer, and the computer hasn't asked me whether I have clearance or not. Just get the answer.
Yeah.
And it comes out of authoritative places. Now you have to learn what an authoritative place is and not pay the same attention to some blogger that has an opinion to sell versus a report by the National Academy of Sciences. You got to recognize that certain sources are more believable, have more credibility.
Absolutely.
But what you can do today in terms of getting that kind of specific information, you couldn't do 5-10 years ago, not to speak of the 50s. So we've made enormous strides.
Absolutely.
Also word processing, I write you an email, I change my mind on the sequence of the paragraphs, I punch a button and I switch them.
Yeah.
Without having to retype the whole thing. Well, I couldn't do that if I would do it by hand. I'd have to do a scissor job and scotch tape. And a lot of people didn't do that. I mean, it wasn't that important to them, so they put out an inferior product that didn't read too well and let the paragraphs stay where they were staying because of the sequence in which you thought of those things, and that may not have been the best way at all to present it.
Right.
From the presentation point of view, you don't care when you thought of it.
Absolutely.
But from the writing point of view, if you haven't thought of it yet, it's hard to put that paragraph in front. You hadn't thought of it yet. So there are as much editing that you can do, much correcting, much upgrading
Right.
that you can do on today's computers with word processing that you weren't able to do before.
Let's look at what was it like for your wife and your children.
They had a ball pretty much. Oak Ridge was a neat community for bringing up kids. The educational system was certainly ahead, and recreational facilities, parks and stuff, were above, far above normal for Tennessee, pretty high up on the national scale, and kids loved it. If even today, there must be hundreds of organizations in just Oak Ridge. I don't care what you're interested in. Chances are there's a bunch of other people interested in the same thing, and they formed an organization that you can belong to. So whereas at one time you had churches, and attendance at churches was, a lot of people attended churches and still attend churches, mainly for people-to-people contacts, rather than what the preacher wants you to do or that's existed, but in addition to that, you now have organizations where I'm the program chairman of an organization called Rowan Anderson Professional Society. It used to be called Rowan Anderson Technical Society, but we didn't like the initials. Rats.
Got it.
So we changed it to the Rowan Anderson Professional Society, and it's RAPS.
That's a little better.
Besides that, we wanted non-technical people to feel free to come.
Yeah.
And we arranged good speakers, and the last speaker we had was yesterday, and he came from the TVA and discussed energy policy and what the TVA is doing to produce clean air.
What's the TVA?
I'm sorry, Tennessee Valley Authority.
Okay.
The local, well, it's a regional, or the biggest United States utility company, owned at the present time by the governor, by the government, the federal government. And they're talking about selling it either together or in pieces to private industry and let it be privatized. But they're an enormous organization, and what they're doing is influential because other power companies can't afford to spend their money the way these guys are spending it in directions, and so they're to a certain extent pioneers. And the head guy of their environmental group, vice president, visited the Rowan Anderson Professional Society, where I'm program chairman, and kept us fascinated for an hour right after lunch in one of the local restaurants not very far from here. The Sagebrush restaurant, if you saw it.
Yeah, right
They have a back room, and we meet there once a month.
Wow.
And I also teach at Oak Ridge Institute of Continued Learning, which is mostly for retired people and seniors. And I teach a course well, it's not really teaching. I moderate a course on options and on issues and options, or issues and choices.
That's wonderful.
And we discuss things that people normally get very emotional about in a sensible way, respecting each other's opinions, but still feeling free to disagree.
Absolutely.
And I'm pretty proud of that effort, and I'm the only one that's doing it for this is now the fourth year in succession. So somebody's satisfied to ask me that for consecutively 4 years.
Sure.
We need more of that in everywhere, not
That's-
just in Oak Ridge,
True.
including some university campuses where they don't know how to discuss anything unemotional. They'd rather throw pies at the speakers and act like little kids.
What do you think is important for the future generations to remember about the K-25 facility?
That it could be done, that a bunch of young squirts that didn't really have much practical experience could get out of college and do as much as they did by being given, first of all, by good education, and then being given the opportunity to use it and to bring it to practical fruition. And I think in terms of education, we've probably gone down since then, because if you look around the campuses today, a lot of the professors have strong accents that you have a hard time understanding them. They're Chinese and Indian and Finnish and Irish, and because those countries produce students that are eager to come to the United States and fill jobs that should be quality jobs that we don't have enough people domestically to fill. The United States produces fewer engineers and scientists today per capita than any other developed or undeveloped nation. We're last, not first, and that's where our inventions are coming from. And we don't even have enough people that qualify to fill those positions. And if you pick up the phone and ask for a service representative to help you on a problem you got on the telephone, and the person has an accent, you think, well, they got an accent, they're probably located in Knoxville or in Atlanta. They may be talking to you from Bombay. Mm-hmm. And you don't even know it. And the reason they have an accent is because they're in Bombay. And they're answering your question like they're sitting next door.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is taking place, and we don't realize that this is going to lower our living standard for sure if we don't take care of it. Yeah. So we're losing out. It's another way of explaining that we're losing out on below par education. I think we've, in many areas, retrogressed instead of advanced. And our advancement has been marginal, not major. Right. And I want to see major achievements. I have a plan where you would save a whole year by the 5th grade. They would have to know at the end of the 5th grade what they're supposed to know today at the end of the 6th grade. So you'd save 1 year, and then hopefully a 2nd year by the 10th grade, and that would leave the last 2 years of high school open for all kinds of advanced subjects. Now that's a major improvement in education. Because instead of turning kids loose that need remedial education in college or at the job, you would go on the offensive. Best defense is an offense, and you would turn loose kids that have already invaded the freshman and sophomore year of the colleges. Yeah. And that would enable the colleges to straighten up too.
What do you think needs to be acknowledged as far as the accomplishments?
The capability of people to produce results if they're properly stimulated and managed. As a manager, it's to quite a degree your job, if you're a good manager, to make the people under you work more effectively by giving them that opportunity. And some people think good management is the leader taking charge. Yeah, but as an individual, there's a limit to how much you can do. I don't care what job you've got, what your position is. The best thing you can do is multiply that by giving the whole team that you're supervisor of a chance to produce as an effective team, a team of individuals, but also a team of teams, and have that work smoothly. And that's what K-25 gave an example of, is that it can be done. We had some darn good managers. I'm not saying that every manager was good, but fortunately, a lot of them were, and they set an example for the other managers. And so basically, K-25 youngsters, baby engineers, were permitted to do a man's job. And they did it. And it speaks well for their managers that they could do it. That's the most important thing.